You are listening to the Big Blue Marble Podcast with Anwar Knight.
And we have liftoff, another edition of the Big Blue Marble Podcast. That, my friends, is what I'm calling the world's smallest live in-studio podcast audience. Yes, that's my family, including Nova at my feet, my golden retriever. Yeah, it's okay, girl. I don't expect you to do much lying at my feet there. That's okay. But thanks, guys. I appreciate that. It wasn't a planned thing, but they said, hey, Daddy, can we hop in? So, yeah, there you are. So now you gotta be quiet now for the rest. Maybe this should be a regular thing. I love a live audience, but in actual fact, you listening right now is what is most important. I greatly appreciate your time and your decision to listen in to the Big Blue Marble Podcast. My name is Anwar Knight, your host, and we have a real interesting show today. But before we get to it, I have to vent. Would you mind? You know, just before we started the show, I was chatting with my wife about what our neighbor did, and we were just gobsmacked. I mean, I didn't want to get into it, but you know what? I'm going to get into it because maybe you can redeem me. I'm so wound up. And let me just set the story here. So we love this neighborhood that we're in, right? We love it so much. We moved just down the street, another house, 7 houses down. It had a bigger backyard for the kids, but we love the neighborhood. We can take them to the school. It's, 3-minute walk. Anyway, the original home, really charming. It's not that it was old, but it had that century home feel to it, And we loved it. We took care of it. We loved gardening. We wanted to make it really a special place. And we actually, work hard outside. We love doing gardening with the kids, so we worked hard on the landscaping. And we planted a purple fountain beech tree. Beautiful. Almost like something you'd see in a Harry Potter movie. The branches arc out and droop. And this thing was about 20 feet tall, and that's the size that we planted. It was a big tree. And also across on the other side of the front, we planted as well a blue spruce tree. Another big one. So at Christmas time, we loaded this thing with lights, and boy, St. Nicholas would be proud. It just looked great. And then this was among garden with rocks and shrubs and flowering plants. And again, we took great pride in it. It looked really nice. So the new people who bought it, they actually just sold it. And they sold it to another couple. Actually, they have some kids, this new family here, and they just moved in. And you know what they did? Yes! They cut it down. They cut down all the trees. Gone. That was $5,000 in trees alone. And then they stripped away the rocks, the plants, everything. So we sort of held back here, and we thought, okay, there's a reason for this. They're going to wow the neighborhood, right? Because we know they hired a landscaper. We've seen the trucks there. And I thought, neighbor, they're doing some really cool mini gazebo or something, or a butcher garden surprise, right? No. You know what they did? They put down grass. Yes! Chainsaw, rip it out, and then just grass, not a single plant. Who does that? Who does that? There's over 20,000 different kinds of trees in the world. And you talk to a realtor, do some Googling here. Landscape gardens with healthy trees, they increase the property value. Some say by as much as 25%. One large tree can provide a day's supply of oxygen for up to 4 people. A large tree can absorb as much as 48 pounds of carbon dioxide per year. And what do? They cut the tree! Am I overreacting? Let me know your thoughts at bigbluemarble.earth. And I get it. Clearly I have a personal connection and I have to let it go because it's not my home anymore. But they cut down the trees. Anyway, I look forward to hearing your thoughts. Our guest today, he penned an open letter to the media imploring journalists to do their job. Sean Holman is a professor of journalism at Mount Royal University and recently challenged Canadian journalists to start reporting on climate change as an emergency. And he says, and this is a quote, "It's the biggest story of our time, And if these failures continue, journalists will be contributing to the deaths of millions. So I ask you, is there a crisis in climate change coverage? Do you feel that the media is not providing the full story? Let me know again at bigbluemarble.earth or via Twitter and Instagram at Anwar Knight. Just hashtag it bigbluemarble. And you're going to want to listen in to this argument. Plus, we'll update the Blue Files, a quick scan of headlines on our changing planet. We'll find out about one of the largest solar parks in the world. It's so big, you can see it from space. Let's get to it right here on the Big Blue Marble Podcast.
Have a question, comment, or show idea? Let us know at bigbluemarble.earth.
We want to thank you for joining us, Sean. I wanted to start by asking you, what was it? What put you over the edge to say, I must pen this open letter? What was it?
It's a really good question. I think it actually started last summer. So as you know, there were devastating wildfires in British Columbia in 2018, and those wildfires spilled over into Alberta in the form of suffocating smoke that really choked both Edmonton and Calgary for extended periods of time. And looking out my window from my apartment in downtown Calgary, what I was struck by was how much that smoke looked like an image from my past. When I was young, I used to read a lot about the future. There were a lot of books put out in the 70s and 80s about what the future would look like. And in one of those books, they showed an image of what would happen if we didn't take care of the planet. And it was startlingly similar to what I saw outside my window.
But an image of that to doing an open letter to media, I have a hard time connecting those dots. I do understand what you're saying. Listen, you don't have to convince me that it's a crisis, without question. But in terms of suggesting that the media not only is not doing their job, you don't mince words here. You pointed out here that if it doesn't change, journalists will be contributing to the death of millions of people. That's your quote. It's pretty harsh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's true. And you're right. It was more than just that image outside my window. It was the fact that the news media was not connecting the dots for the public about what was causing those fires and what was causing that smoke. Every day I read news reports about this emergency that we were in, and hardly any of them mentioned the fact that climate change was to blame. Climate change was the driver behind these forest fires. And if the media isn't mentioning that information, then the public can't possibly make good decisions in their public and private lives about what to do about this crisis, because they might not even know one exists. And that's really our responsibility as journalists. We provide the information that is necessary for the public to do rational, empathetic decisions, both at the checkout line and also in the voting booth. That's our job. That's our only job. And if we're not doing that job on the biggest story of our time, climate change, we will be responsible for inaction on climate change, on the climate crisis.
But to be fair, and as a journalist, you know the focus initially is the people's story, the human story, the loss of life, destruction of property, anguish of thousands of people perhaps evacuating, the fact that they no longer have a place where they're employed, of course, the courageous work of firefighters. Generally speaking, that's how it's executed initially.
Right, but that's part of the problem, is that our coverage of these kinds of natural disasters, these kinds of extreme weather incidents and temperatures, has not caught up with the reality of the situation. In the past, it used to be beside the point as to what was causing these things, because it was just Mother Nature. We couldn't do anything about it, so it really didn't matter whether or not the media mentioned it or not. But we live in a different time. We live in a time where we can do something about these kinds of extreme events. And we should be clear with the public about that. And we should be clear with the public about that at the time, because as you know, public and media attention often wanes after these kinds of limited time emergencies end. So we really need to be delivering that information as it is happening.
You know, the thing is, though, part of the reason why I wanted to launch this podcast, The Big Blue Marble, is because I think that overall, media is in part to blame, but I think it's because we've overcomplicated the matter. The media was telling the story initially, and of course that is now evolving. You know, every week we're getting more science on it. But initially it became so complicated where we latched onto buzzwords. You know, greenhouse gases, atmospheric warming, carbon dioxide, glacial melt, fossil fuels, carbon footprint. It goes on and on. And it nurtured defeat. It was so complicated. If you don't understand it, you're going to tend to ignore it. So I wonder, my question here is that at what point does the public sort of have to take a responsibility to be also engaged, to say, hey, you know, if you're talking about the fire situation, this is happening right now in my neighborhood. What has caused this? If my house is flooded out in the Ottawa Valley, or if I'm down into the U.S. Southeast and, you know, the biggest hurricane has occurred, the strongest one maybe in 2 decades, when do I have to say something is not right here? This is not the norm.
Right. And I think you're right. There certainly is a level of public responsibility that comes into play here, but we can only really deal with what our responsibility is, what our part of this problem is. And I think we also bear some responsibility for the problem of inaction. Not only do we not always report the way we should on climate change, we have also given space for those people who deny the scientific evidence surrounding it. And we continue to do that, even though we see this year deadly heat waves across the world. We see the Arctic burning. We see lots of evidence that we are in a climate crisis. So I think journalists really need to think deeply about what our role is at this particular time.
But are you suggesting then some media is not telling the truth? Or just not covering it the way you expect it to be covered?
I think both is happening. For example, the Vancouver Sun published an op-ed by a Fraser Institute fellow and a University of Guelph economics professor saying that we only have a vague inkling that we might be in a climate emergency a decade from now. And that certainly would be a surprise to many of the Vancouver Sun's readers who have already experienced that emergency as a result of climate change-fueled wildfires that devastated British Columbia, not just in 2018, but in 2017. And we're making a choice to give space to that opinion.
Do you think some of that has to do with you don't want to upset the advertisers? Do you think that plays a role at all in any media outlet?
I think it's hard to say. I mean, I think that advertising influence and political influence in news media organizations does happen. I've seen it. I've reported on it. I've exposed it. I've been subjected to it. But it happens a lot less than I think people think it does. What I think is actually happening is we are having a conflict between two competing values as journalists. On one hand, we want to appear unbiased, and we want to appear unbiased because we want people to believe that we're telling the truth, and we want people to tune into us and buy our product. And then on the other hand, we have what I think is a higher value to tell the truth. But the problem is we're living at a time when the very act of telling the truth makes us appear biased to large swaths of our audience who are strangers to the truth. So what do we do in that situation? I think we still have to continue to tell the truth, because if we don't, I don't know what we're doing.
What role do you think social media, though, has played in this? You know, the reality is fake news and the rapid spread of misinformation is in itself a crisis that I think globally is having a profound effect on so many levels. It perpetuates falsehoods that create doubt on variable facts. And that is certainly true when it comes to the climate change or climate crisis.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we have really never lived at a time when we have had this level of doubt, this number of people who both consciously and unconsciously disregard the evidence. And you're right, the internet is playing a role in that. Social media is playing a role in that because it has allowed for the creation of self-perpetuating propaganda machines that can allow these individuals to live in pseudo-realities where the evidence appears to be lies.
Is there any media anywhere in the world that you're aware of that you think is getting it right, is telling the story the way it needs to be told?
Well, I have a great admiration, of course, for what The Guardian has been doing on this particular issue. And there's also the Covering Climate Now initiative that's been launched by two journalists down in the United States. And the two partners for that project are The Guardian and the Columbia Journalism Review. And there's a number of media organizations, including Maclean's Magazine in Canada and the Tyee, where I wrote my open letter, that have joined in that initiative to try to ensure that we do better when it comes to climate change, that we cover the climate crisis with the urgency that it demands.
So what do you think that the public do want in terms of a story?
That's a really good question. So I think when people turn to the news media for coverage, they want two things. One is they want to be able to have a feeling of control. In other words, they need information that allows them to make decisions where they can have some degree of control over the world around them. And the other thing that they want out of the media is they want certainty. They want to feel more certain about the world around them. And I think we're failing on both those fronts. Let me give you a quick example. Whenever there is a major disaster, let's say a wildfire, let's say flooding, or let's say a public health crisis, the media is often really clear with the public about what they should be doing at that time of crisis. In fact, we repeat that message ad nauseum. How many times have you heard the media recommend people evacuate homes, seek higher ground, don't go outside? That's something that we regularly do to provide a level of certainty and control for the public. But we're not doing that in this particular circumstance. In fact, a lot of what we're doing is actually increasing the feelings of uncontrollability and uncertainty that the public is experiencing at this time of crisis. So I think we really need to take a look at how we're handling this particular issue and whether or not we're actually really giving the public what they need. Would it be so wrong, for example, for us in the media to say that scientists recommend that you can mitigate climate change by not eating meat or giving up less meat or driving less? I mean, these are all actually major things that we can do to take control over the situation. These are all things that would have a major impact, and these are all things that scientists have recommended. So why aren't we saying that on a regular basis?
Well, I think there has been certainly some reporting on that.
Yes, there has, but certainly not in the same way that we would if there was a crisis. I mean, I go back to the point that I mentioned earlier. You know, if there was flooding, if there was a wildfire, if there was any other kind of disaster, we would be repeating those kind of messages on the hour. But we're not doing that right now as part of our regular climate change coverage.
But if we ramp it up now to the point of every day you're going to hear this message, could that be counterproductive, where it's now a tune-out factor? And I want to draw an example, a comparison. And I agree, it's not, we're not talking apples and apples here. This is apples and oranges. But if you recall back to 9/11 and the Homeland Security Advisory System, after that fateful day, they upgraded their advisory system, and it was color bars. There was low, there was guarded, elevated, high, and severe, with bright red, severe, and a turquoise blue, if you will, for low. CNN would actually run that daily, almost like a forecast, and they would say, your terror alert level today is. There was some pushback that some would say you're fear-mongering here. I'm seeing this every day, when the likelihood of something like that catastrophe to happen again is probably small. I'm not going to second guess and judge, Homeland Security or CNN, but I'm just saying I think there's a slight risk of that, and I want to know what your take on it was.
There is, but I would also say that that's somewhat different, because what I'm recommending is that we provide the public with information that they need to feel more certain and more in control about this situation that we find ourselves in. Saying that there's a threat level and that there's risks is kind of what we're doing right now when it comes to climate change. We're not really providing that same kind of solution on a repeated basis that can make people feel more certain and more in control about what's going on. So I think that we do need to be treating this as an emergency. And I get the fatigue thing, but I think we counter fatigue by giving people the things that they need to personally do.
But if we were to change this, if the media were to adjust how they report it, would there be any metrics to measure success, that this is the way to do it?
Well, I think the metric would be, are we seeing a sea change in the political agendas of our countries? And are we actually seeing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions fall? That's really the only metric that matters right now. And I would say, are people taking more personal action in their day-to-day lives on this particular issue?
Well, it's funny. For years I've said, for the naysayers, well, this is a cyclical thing that we're going through. It happens all the time. At the end of the day, how could helping Mother Earth or helping the planet be a bad thing? Whether it's reducing, your garbage, recycling, just trying to do things that are more eco-friendly, how could that be a bad thing? But ultimately, Sean, and I really believe this, that we as consumers can force change. Yes, we want to be informed without question, but if we don't buy that product from certain companies that are affecting the planet, they will change it. And you look back in the 80s of Greenpeace, they took McDonald's to task when it came to styrofoam containers. They started, actually picketing the restaurants. And at first, McDonald's tried to brush it off their shoulder, but it gained momentum. And you have to remember, this is well before social media and even major internet coverage. But they realized that the movement is in play here, that customers are starting to say, you know what? You're right. I don't want my burger container to sit in landfill for the next 90 years. So ultimately, one of the most successful franchise in history says we're going to change our practices. So I wonder, and this goes back to having responsibility as a member of a community, that ultimately it's us as consumers that make that decision and force change. And I'm wondering if that maybe weighs more than suggesting media cover it, in terms of labeling it as a crisis. I'm just wondering what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, I would agree, but we can also be advising the public on what to do. Let's talk about, for example, switching to a plant-based diet. That's actually a healthy thing to do. So even if we were to leave aside the impact that meat has on the planet, it actually is a healthier thing for us to do to switch to a plant-based diet. So we should all be doing that, regardless of whether or not it has an effect on the planet or not. And if the media was clear on a more regular basis about the impact that meat does have on the planet and the impact that switching to a plant-based diet could have on the planet, I think people would feel good about that. I think people would feel that they were more in control of that.
I can see the emails coming in now, though, from the meat industry.
Yeah, but you know what? The Weather Network actually experienced that when they put out a very mild story about the benefits of reducing meat consumption, which is really sad. But the fact of the matter is that we are in an emergency, and I think the government should be stepping up to support industries that may be significantly disrupted by what's happening, maybe permanently disrupted by what's happening. But we have to make these changes because if we don't, the consequences are going to be more severe for us all.
I have to say, though, something with what you're suggesting, just with the meat in itself, that would be very difficult for government to get involved. I mean, you look at Western Canada. I mean, that's a primary economy there. So it would be very difficult for any political leader to endorse that.
But let me just push back on that for a moment. So to be clear, what I'm asking the government to do is I'm asking the government to step in and support industries that are going to be disrupted by the changes that we need to have to make. Because that, again, provides them with a feeling of certainty and control. I don't want anyone to be out of work as a result of this. I don't want to see anyone's livelihood jeopardized. But here's the thing. Government has taken action on these kinds of issues in the past. One need only look at war rationing as an example of that. So we do actually have a history of this kind of government intervention when there is a crisis. And what I think is that we need to voluntarily start making these changes before either A, they need to be forced on us, or B, it's too late.
And maybe it'll be a combination of both. I hope not.
I hope not. In a society where we have lost the ability to convince one another, the only alternative is force one way or the other. And that really worries me. I'm really scared about that. And I'm scared about what it means for the planet.
Now, if you could imagine a headline where it was covered the way you perceive it to be covered, and there has been success in terms of the carbon emissions. Everybody has, grouped together and we've made a difference. What would that headline be?
That's a really good question. I think it would be just simply the world unites to fight climate change. And you know what? To a certain extent, that is less important than whether or not we succeed. I think we can only try. That's all we can do. It is ultimately the trying that is the most important thing.
Well, you and I certainly hope that does happen, and I guess that's a part of what we're hoping to help do, is get the word out. I want to thank you so much, Sean Holman, for joining us, Associate Professor of Journalism at Mount Royal University, Freedom of Information researcher, and founding editor of the online investigative political news service, Public Eye. You can connect with him at seanholman.com. Time for a quick scan of headlines from around the world on our changing planet as we open up the Blue Files. We begin underwater off the coast of Wales, where this winter a specialized underwater crew will be planting acres of seagrass at Dale Beach, Pembrokeshire in southwest Wales, the goal to help tackle climate change. Over 1 million seeds of what are being called a wonder plant will not only act as a nursery for marine life, but will also help lock in billions of tons of carbon. Jenny Oates, the UK Seas Program Manager at World Wildlife Fund, says seagrass is something that can store carbon 35 times faster than a tropical forest, an incredible feat for a submarine plant. This endeavor is the UK's biggest seagrass restoration project after over 90% of the plants were lost in the last 100 years. These seagrass meadows naturally exist on every continent except in the cold waters of Antarctica. To harness the power of the sun, crews in Egypt are putting the finishing touches on one of the world's largest solar installations. The Benban Solar Park will be made up of more than, get this, 7 million photovoltaic panels. The renewable resource project is so massive that it'll be visible from space. Officials implemented a plan to build the $4 billion project after enduring repeated blackouts caused by fuel shortages. The park is about 600 kilometers south of Cairo and will not only increase Egypt's power generation capacity, but will also serve to incorporate more renewable sources into the country's power generation mix. Despite its undeniably sunny climate, solar isn't the only renewable energy that Egypt is investing in. It also plans to build huge wind farms on the Red Sea. If extreme heat, severe storms, and a potential food crisis doesn't get climate crisis deniers' attention, maybe their toilet will. A new United Nations report says that rising sea levels could render as many as 60 million toilets inoperable in the United States. About 1 in 5 American households rely on septic systems to handle their toilet waste, according to the Environmental Protection Agency. These systems work by draining flush toilets into an underground tank where bacteria breaks it down into water and solid sludge. That water then moves through an outflow tube and into a drainage field. However, as sea levels rise, those drainage fields are becoming saturated, preventing them from absorbing liquid from septic tanks. In addition, erosion removes the necessary soft earth to filter out pollutants, resulting in public health hazards and groundwater contamination. Florida is just one state that is especially vulnerable. Its sea level has risen in some areas by as much as 8 inches or 20 centimeters since the 1950s. And that's this edition of the Blue Files. And this is the thing, it's no longer just about dramatic long-term impacts. Climate change is and will continue to affect our daily lives. For some, it may be the toilets. For others, shortages of key ingredients for things like your morning coffee or beer. I guess it's all connected in more ways than one, but we'll continue to put that in the spotlight here on the Big Blue Marble podcast. Before we wrap up, a big hello to Sarah listening in Markham, Ontario, Christina in Vancouver Island, also Fred in Dallas, Texas. I appreciate all of your valuable time and your company listening in to this podcast. You can connect with me anytime, all the time at bigbluemarble.earth. Be sure, by the way, to subscribe to my newsletter. Lots of cool behind-the-scenes stuff there. And you'll also see on the site a link to subscribe to this podcast. Please do that. Not only so you won't miss a show, but it really does help the show grow. In fact, I would greatly appreciate it if you also share this podcast, my friends. Literally, there's a little button link there where you can share it via email, message, Twitter, or Facebook. Whatever your favorite digital platform is, your help is instrumental in the success of the show, and I thank you for your ongoing support. Let's all be a part of the change that needs to happen to save our planet. I'm Anwar Knight, wishing you a great day on the Big Blue Marble.
That was another great show, Daddy.